Thank you for tuning in for another story from our hometown scrapbook. This one's called The Stone Man. Hello there! Did you ever hear about Grays Harbor Paleolithic Man? Did you ever hear how the citizens of Grays Harbor stood in line and paid a dime, back when a dime was real money, to see the stone man that was dug up in Hoquiam? Well, it's quite a story as yarns go, and there are a lot of Grays Harbor people around yet who recall having dug down into their pockets for that 10 cents to admit themselves to one of the most wonderful of Grays Harbor attractions, a homemade petrified man said to be 1,000 years old. And after Dick has had a word from our sponsor, we'll get back to tell you the amazing discovery in Hoquiam that was front page news all over America. Here you are, Dick, a word from our sponsor. It was 1911 and the circus was coming to Hoquiam. Now that might account for many things, such as the anticipation in children's eyes at the mention of the event, or the sight of bright colored posters, but it can hardly be expected to account for what took place on the 22nd Street in Hoquiam, where they were excavating for the street fills and blasting for new OWRR and N railroad right-of-way. But it did. That it will be noted later that it did. And this is what happened. Readers of the Hoquiam Washingtonian, a publication was known in those days, were startled to read that a petrified man had been discovered over the 22nd Street. But readers were a little slow if they had read the first, for the town had already heard the story, which spread like wildfire. The Aberdeen construction crew was working over on the 22nd Street, blasting for the OWRR and N right-of-way, when workmen on the Bloomquist property uncovered something that had a familiar look. True, it was stone, or something like it, but it had the appearance of a man. They knocked the mud off of it and looked again. It was a stone image of a man. Now, there was the question first of what to do with it. And an onlooker who seemed familiar with such things advised them to get in touch with C.C. Pinnock to take charge of the thing. And Claude Pinnock obliged, picking up the torso and carting it away. It was cleaned up, and a selected few were permitted to view the amazing find, with an eye to obtaining what was called scientific information. Among those permitted to view the fossil was a Washingtonian reporter known as Squeak, and Squeak plays an important part, as we shall see, in this scientific background of discovery. Albert Johnson had just taken over the Washingtonian, and he showed a vast amount of interest in the discovery, so much so that the Associated Press wire was filled with the tale of the amazing discovery made in Hoquiam, Washington. And by the time it went out on the wire, there was quite a fund of scientific knowledge available for some unidentified source. For one thing, it was decided that it must be the torso of a Flathead Indian, at least 1,000 years old. It was a fossil of a powerful and well-built man with a 35 waist and a 38 chest. It was described as being much like a Greek statue, though those so described it could find no better comparison than that the arms were broken off. There were also claims to the torso. A man named Blanchard made the discovery. It was on Bloomquist property, and Claude Pinnock had the fossil, which made it his by the traditional 9 points of law. But whoever the owner might be, it belonged to Hoquiam, and the town intended to make it their best. To claim the doubtful and forward the cause of science, Dr. McIntyre viewed the fossil and stated for publication, "It is one of the most wonderful things I've ever seen. It's not a fake. It couldn't be a fake." And by this time, the Associated Press wires out of the Washingtonian office were hot with the news of the amazing discovery. Inquiries were arriving from fossil hunters and archaeologists throughout the Northwest. And to get varied opinions on the find, Squeak worked out all the angles. One theory advanced by Hoquiam residents was that it was the petrified remains of an explorer who had been lost in the wilds of the Northwest and had perished here, only to be preserved by a trick of nature. Oh, there were great possibilities, all right, and none of them were overlooked. Anyhow, the circus finally showed up, and with it crowds of people from Hump Tulips, from Aberdeen, and from across the harbor. And adjoining the circus grounds in an adventurous spot was the special display of the Hoquiam Stone Man, admission 10 cents. Now, the circus was a good one, and such attractions were not frequent on the harbor. But the big top had nothing to offer that could compete with the torso of the prehistoric creature who had been handed down 1,000 years to become overnight Hoquiam's first citizen. And the crowds thronged through the tent, dropping their dimes into the swelling fund of the shadowy promoters who stayed as much as possible in the background. Well, while the crowds were still thronging through the tent to see the amazing sight, a drop of suspicion was forming. No one inspecting the fossil could adjudge it as phony, but there had been some talk in the background, and a few sly winks when the Stone Man was mentioned, and somehow people felt that the Stone Man might not be all that it should be, and it wasn't. But that's another story that'll take up in a few seconds after a few words from our sponsor. Dick? But in spite of winks and knowing smiles, the company formed the exhibit. The Stone Man ran their take for the display over the $200 mark, and when the circus folded its tents, the company folded theirs likewise. And although there was talk of taking the Stone Man on tour throughout the Northwest, for some reason the community in charge seemed reluctant to take their scientific discovery to foreign fields. And then finally the story broke. Squeaky, who had acted as press agent for the project, was given the beat on the yarn, and he told all, or almost all, and the story behind the story was as good and as amazing as the yarn and the discovery itself. For the whole thing had been carefully executed promotion to capitalize on the circus, have some fun, and give the Washingtonian reporter a scoop on a bright story. It had started when Claude Pinnock, Brett Pearson, Charlie Davis, Lem Warren, and Dr. Nail had gotten together one evening, and someone had turned up the idea of creating a stone man. Dr. Nail, who was familiar with plaster of Paris casting process, described a method by which one could be created, and a volunteer was encased in the plaster mix. Then, working with a good structural mix of concrete, the pranksters filled the cast and waited for it to set. When the fossil had been properly hardened, it was planted near the excavation on 22nd Street, where it would be sure to be found, and the scheme was worked out for its discovery. As things developed, it looks like a natural tie-in with the coming circus. So when the Stone Man had been recovered, it was given a suitable newspaper build-up with the assistance of Albert Johnson and Squeaky, and made the most prominent resident of Hoquiam at just 10 cents a look. Just how many museums were interested in this amazing find is not a matter of record. However, the curator at the Ferry Museum in Tacoma is said to have made hurried inquiries about obtaining the fossil for a future display. And anthropologists and archaeologists from the university had a lot of questions to be answered before they got wind of the prank and withdrew to a safe distance to avoid being professionally trapped by pranksters. Now, it would be nice to add to our story a footnote that the finders of the stone man, who profited so handsomely from their venture and got so many good laughs as a bonus, kept the principle in their joke in a safe place and have preserved it this day as a monument to time when Hoquiam made the front pages from coast to coast, as a place where one of man's most amazing scientific discoveries was made. There is a Cro-Magnon man, a Piltdown skull, and what a tribute to the town's scientific prosperity, if there could have been, presented by the Hoquiam man. But unfortunately, when the concrete figure had paid off in dimes, the corporation for the display of the 22nd Street man bore their trophy to the Hoquiam Elks Club, where it enjoyed a measure of distinction and was finally one of the unnecessaries that the janitor fell over when he went to clean out the paraphernalia room. And since the ancient relic has not turned up since the remodeling work began on the Hoquiam Elks home, it can only be assumed that some maintenance man over the long years got tired of moving the monolith from one side of the storeroom to the other and heaved it out into a vacant lot as fill material, as he long since has been discovered and forgotten. But that poses another great possibility. Perhaps generations from now, when Hoquiam can look back on a century or two of local history, workmen excavating for a new building will again turn up the petrified man at this time. There may be none to identify it, none to tell the story of the prank. The city will enjoy its place in publicity, safe from the knowing winks, smug chuckles, and of the pranksters, who made a lot of fun for Grays Harbor back when the place was young. And now, Dick, say a few words from our sponsor. Practical jokes, the kind that hurt no one and provide lots of good laughs for everyone, used to be one of Grays Harbor principal stocks of entertainment. In the horse and buggy days, the sawdust towns honored certain of their citizens with the title of wag, which stamped them as town clowns, honored and appreciated. There's such men like Dick Faulkner, whose tall tales we once discussed in this program, and Dr. Seth Maker, the dentist and publisher of the Sunday Sun. We'll take a whole program some evening and tell you about Doc, the little man who was always ready for anything and whose picturesque exploits carried him on into the field of radio when he was already piled up with 70 of years. And there were such groups as the quintet that conceived the idea of a concrete man, maneuvered their prank into front page publicity for Hoquiam, and the Nuts of Unit, the organization of pranksters who played their jokes with such vigor that they are recalled today, after 40 years, as classics of the art of practical jokes. We'll dig into these stories one evening soon and tell about the Practical Jokers Club that traveled all the way from Michigan to Grays Harbor to play a colorful part in some of the shenanigans of these small towns back in the sawdust days. But tomorrow night we're going to deal with a more serious subject, and one that the old-timers weren't exactly proud of when it all was over. We call it the Chinese affair, and tell it just as if we were there in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.